A very warm welcome from Singapore to our audience from across the world. I'm Nguyen Phu from the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, and I'm very happy to be here today to co-organize this event with Professor Phu Trang, who heads the Political Science Department from the University of Oregon, USA. The genesis for today's webinar arose out of an earlier effort on the part of ISIS and University of Oregon to bring several experts from Asia, the United States, Europe, and Oceania to share their insights on the key political and socio-economic developments in Vietnam at a physical symposium in Singapore on this very day. Just a side note that the timing for today's webinar has largely to do with the need to take into account the different time zones where our experts are based. So for today's webinar, as a curtain raiser of sorts for what is to come for next year, Professor Phu Trang and I thought that we could focus on a particular topic of great interest in Vietnam in the coming months, which has to do with the leadership succession at the 13th National Congress of the Vietnam Communist Party due in early 2021. This is the foremost important event held once every 5 years. The Congress will set the socio-economic agenda for Vietnam for the next 10 years from 2021 to 2030. And more importantly, for the purpose of today's webinar, it will elect new leaders at the top to replace the retiring ones. We have two distinguished speakers today. The first is our in-house foremost Vietnam expert, Dr. Lê Hồng Hiap, who has written extensively on Vietnam's domestic politics and foreign policy. And Hiap will be speaking to us on the selection criteria for the Politburo members, including who will be stepping down and who are likely to be elevated to the Politburo. The second speaker is Professor Phu Trang, who is another avid watcher of Vietnam's politics and has published extensively on topics related to the Vietnam Communist Party. Professor Trang will speak after Hiap, and he will be sharing his insights on the leadership change and the legacies of current General Secretary Nguyen Phu Trang. Before I invite Hiap to make his presentation, let me extend a very warm welcome to my co-organizer, Professor Phu Trang from the University of Oregon, to make some welcome remarks. Professor Phu Trang, please, the mic is yours. Professor Phu Trang, you have to unmute yourself. Yes, okay.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Nguyen Phu, for the nice introduction. And good afternoon, everyone. I'm so excited to welcome you all to this webinar. It's my great honor and pleasure to welcome you all. And my name again is Phu Trang, and I'm a professor of political science at the University of Oregon. And I'm also director of the U.S. Vietnam Research Center, which we founded last year to promote research on Vietnam, on U.S.-Vietnam relations, and on the Vietnamese American community. So on behalf of my team at the U.S. Vietnam Research Center, I would like to thank the host, the ISIS Yusof Ishaq Institute for their collaboration with us to organize this event. And actually, we planned for a physical event to happen in Singapore today, and it was supposed to be in Singapore today too. But unfortunately, the pandemic affected all of us, and we have to reschedule the physical event to next June. And so, but because we think that this is an important occasion to reflect on the last 10 years of the political economic situations in Vietnam, and to think ahead as the Vietnamese Communist Party is preparing its Congress to take place in next January. So it's an important for us to gather to talk about what's going to happen, what has taken place in Vietnam, in the last 10 years under the leadership of the current General Secretary, Mr. Nguyen Phu Trang, and then what can we expect, to happen at the Congress and moving forward in the future. So thank you again for joining us today, and I would like to pass the control back to Nguyen Phu.
Thank you, Professor Phu Trang. May I invite Hiap to start the ball rolling? Hiap, please.
Okay, good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here today to talk about the politics of leadership succession. We know that the party congress will take place early next year, probably in January. And one of the big topics that most people are interested in will be the question of leadership change. Who will stay on? Who will retire? So in this 20-minute presentation, I will discuss these issues. But here's the outline. Before I go into the issue of leadership succession, I will talk briefly about how the CPV Congress is organized and how the issue of leadership succession fits in here. And next, I will pose some structural questions that will define the leadership succession. And then I will go into the election of the Central Committee, the election of Politburo, and then I will discuss briefly the prospects of potential candidates for the top leadership, that is the 4 top position in the political system. And in the end, I will wrap up by discussing some political implications of the leadership change next year. So most of you should have been familiar with the with how the party congress is organized, but for those of you who are not so familiar, here's the procedure. So every 5 years, the party will organize the National Congress to shape the policy for the country and also to elect the new leadership. So this year, 5.2 million members will elect their delegates to upper level party conferences, and this process will result in the election of more than 1,500 delegates who will attend the National Congress early next year. And the party congress will have 2 major functions. First, it will pass some key documents, and here you can see some major documents that the party congress will review and adopt. First, the political report of the current Central Committee, and next, the review report on socio-economic development strategy for the past 10 years, and most importantly, they will also adopt the socio-economic development strategy for the next 10 years. And the next 10 years will be crucial to Vietnam's economic growth and development. And we recently learned that the party has set the target of turning Vietnam into a fully industrialized country by 2045. To implement this strategy successfully, the leadership question is very important. Who will lead the country will decide to some extent whether the party can implement the strategy successfully, and this is where the leadership change of the succession issue fits in. So the next function of the Congress is to elect the Central Committee, which in turn will elect the Politburo, the General Secretary, the Secretariat of the party, and also the Inspection Commission. Then they will also nominate candidates for the state and government positions for the new, government, which will be formed next year. Before we go into details about the, elections of various institutions and positions, we have to take a broader view, a broader look at some structural questions, which I think will shape the overall outcome of the elections. First, one question is whether the party will revert to the former 4-pillar structure or the 3-pillar structure current, or maintain the current 3-pillar structure. We know that 2 years ago, the late President Trần Đại Quang passed away, and Mr. Trong was elected to hold the presidency concurrently with his previous position of party secretary. Now, one question is whether they will go back to the 4-pillar question or not. Another question is, we know that there's an age limit of 65 for Politburo members seeking re-election. By tradition, there should be only one exception because, exception means unique. If there are too many exceptions, it's not exception anymore. So, but the problem here is that there may be more than one candidate who want to seek re-election. So another question is, there will be one exception to the age limit of 65 for Politburo members or more than one. The third question is, we know that the party tries to maintain a balanced regional representation in the top leadership, but it seems that now this may be compromised. So another question is whether the balanced regional representation in the leadership, in the top leadership, will be mandatory or not. And finally, the question of the balance of power, between competing camps and candidates who has stronger support base, and this will determine whether they will win the election or not. Now I will go into the elections of Central Committee. We know that the current Central Committee has 184 members and 20 alternate members. And in the next party congress, this structure will be maintained. And among 184 members of the Central Committee, about 85 to 90 of them are current members seeking re-elections. That means only about half of the 184 members will be fresh candidates, new members who will be elected from the new candidates. In theory, there are 3 age groups: under 50 and 51 to 60 and above 61. And the majority of them will be in the age range of 51 to 60. And those above 61, mainly those will be elected into the Politburo. And there's also a quota for key blocks in the Central Committee to ensure some reasonable and balanced representation structure. We will have a quota for central government institutions, provincial governments, and especially the military and the public security forces, who will together form a block of about 15% of Central Committee membership. And there are also members from ethnic minorities or women members, but this is flexible, and we will see how what will be the lineup for the next Central Committee. And the list of candidates, are still being discussed and likely to be finalized at the forthcoming 13th plenum, which will take place soon. The Central Committee will elect the Politburo, which is the top decision-making body in Vietnam. And like the current Politburo, the next Politburo is likely to have 19 members. And as I mentioned, there's an age limit of 65 for current members seeking re-election. But again, the number of exceptions will determine the lineup of the next Politburo, and by extension, the lineup of the top leadership. In terms of age limit, we know that among the 16 current Politburo members, 8 are due to retire due to the age limits, but there should be exceptions. And to make it clearer to you, I have a chart here which show the 19 members of the Politburo elected in 2016. So among them, we know that 3 of them are automatically disqualified because of various reasons. Mr. Trần Đại Quang passed away 2 years ago. Mr. Đinh Thế Vinh fell ill and will not be able to join the election. Mr. Đinh La Thăng, he was removed because of corruption charges. One uncertain case, but I think maybe disqualified, is Mr. Hoàng Trung Hải. He was formerly party secretary of Hanoi, but recently he was disciplined for past economic mismanagement. So in theory, he's still age eligible for election, but because of that disciplinary actions, he may not be eligible for re-election. And if we look at the age limit, in theory, 8 members of the current Politburo will have to retire, including Mr. Trương Hòa Bình, Deputy PM, Mr. Ngô Xuân Lịch, Defense, Madam Nguyễn Thị Kim Ngân, Chair of the National Assembly, Mr. Nguyễn Thiện Nhân, Party Secretary of Ho Chi Minh City, Madam Tòng Thị Phóng, Deputy Chair of the National Assembly, Mr. Nguyễn Xuân Phúc, Prime Minister, Mr. Nguyen Phu Trang, Party Secretary and State President, and Mr. Trần Quốc Vượng, standing member of the Secretariat of the party. And that means only 7 current members are qualified for re-elections. That is Mr. Nguyễn Văn Bình, head of the Economic Commission, Mr. Phạm Minh Chính, head of the Personnel and Organization Commission, Mr. Vương Đình Huệ, formerly Deputy PM and currently Party Secretary of Hanoi, Mr. Tô Lâm, Minister of Public Security, Ms. Trương Thị Mai, head of Mobilization Commission, Mr. Phạm Bình Minh, Deputy PM and Foreign Minister, and Mr. Võ Văn Thưởng, head of the Propaganda and Education Commission. But as I mentioned, there are exceptions. The question is how many exceptions will there be? Most people believe that Mr. Trần Quốc Vượng will be exempted from the age limit because of the possibility that he will be elected to become the next General Secretary. And by tradition, normally only the position for General Secretary will be exempted from the age limit, but there have been talks that Mr. Nguyễn Xuân Phúc, who is the current Prime Minister, will also seek to be exempted from the age limit as well. Mr. Phúc has served as a Prime Minister for only 1 term, and there's some support for him to stay on as well. But again, the rule is that there should be as few exceptions as possible to make the exceptions meaningful. So we will have to wait and see whether Mr. Phúc will be successful in seeking another term or not. And that is going to be decided later, possibly at the 13th plenum, but in certain cases, we may have to wait until the final days before the Congress actually takes place. For the Politburo, other candidates for the Politburo, if we look at the tradition, normally the non-Politburo members of the previous Secretariat of the Central Committee will be promoted into members of the next Politburo. And if we go by that tradition, we can predict that the current non-Politburo members of the Secretariat will stand a big chance, to be elected into the next Politburo, and they include Mr. Nguyễn Văn Nên, head of the Central Office of the party, Mr. Nguyễn Hòa Bình, the Chief Justice, Mr. Lương Cường, the party commissar, of the army, Mr. Phan Đình Trạc, head of the Internal Affairs Commission, Mr. Nguyễn Xuân Thắng, director of the Ho Chi Minh Academies of Politics, Mr. Trần Thanh Mẫn, chairman of the Fatherland Front, and Mr. Trần Cẩm Tú, head of the Inspection Commission. But if we look at their profile and their background, as well as the possible positions that they may be assigned to hold in the next term, we can see that among them, Mr. Nguyễn Xuân Thắng may stand a lesser chance to be elected, because if he is elected into the next Politburo, his likely position is head of the Propaganda and Education Commission. But for that position, I believe that Mr. Võ Văn Thưởng, the current head of the commission, may be re-elected to hold that position. So that means the possibility for Mr. Thắng to be elected into the next Politburo is dimmer. But we know there are 19 members in the Politburo, so there should be more candidates, fresh candidates outside the Secretariat. We don't know yet, but there have been some rumors or discussion within different circles about potential faces that may be considered for the next Politburo, and they include Mr. Trần Tuấn Anh, and the current Minister of Industry and Trade. He has a strong economic background, and if he is elected into the Politburo, I think he may play an important role in the future. Mr. Vũ Đức Đam, Deputy PM, Mr. Đam has done a very good job in helping Vietnam contain coronavirus up until July and until now. So he has won a lot of endorsement within the Central Committee to be elected into the Politburo, the next Politburo. Madam Lê Thị Nga, one senior member in the National Assembly, and she's one of the few ladies who may be considered for the next Politburo. And Mr. Nguyen Phu Trang, by tradition, the party secretary of Ho Chi Minh City will be automatically Politburo member, and Mr. Phong is currently chairman of the Ho Chi Minh City People's Committee, and he's also a likely candidate for the next Politburo. Now we go to the election of the top leadership. As I mentioned, it's very likely that the party will revert to the four-pillar structure. I think the party is very interested in maintaining a balance of a power or a check and balance system within the top leadership, and they would like to maintain this four-pillar structure for that purpose. And there are different criteria for the different positions here, but there's one common condition for all of them is that they should have served as a Politburo member for one full term. And if we base on that criteria, we see that there are 6 or 7 of them who may be considered for these positions, meaning Mr. Binh, Mr. Chinh, Mr. Huệ, Mr. Tô Lâm, Ms. Mai, and Mr. Chinh, and Mr. Thượng, and plus special cases, and we don't know how many cases will be treated as special cases. As I mentioned, one big unknown is whether Mr. Phuc will seek to stay or not, and whether his effort will be successful or not. And we have to wait and see. And if we look at the current, Politburo members who may be eligible for election into the top leadership, we see that there's likely no candidate from the South. That is because Mr. Thượng is the only candidate from the South, and he's still relatively young. That means his chance to be elected into the top 4 or top 5 leadership is rather limited. Now I will discuss some, likely candidate for the top positions here. The first one is the General Secretary position. Many people agree that Mr. Trần Quốc Vượng is likely to be the top candidate here. We don't rule out other candidates, but he seems to be the front runner. He's from the North. He's a long-time party official, and more importantly, he has some credentials, that I think Mr. Trump will value, and especially his past role as the top prosecutor of Vietnam, and also the head of the Inspection Commission. So if he is elected, he is in a good position to carry on Mr. Trump's legacy, that is the fight against corruption. So he's seen as a top candidate, but people also talk about other possibilities as well, like Mr. Phuc, who may also be considered for the position. So there will be some competition, but I believe Mr. Vượng has some advantage in this race. Next, the position of president. I think, again, we have to go back to the big question whether Mr. Phuc will stay on. If he stay on, there's a possibility that he will be promoted to the president position. But if he is not successful in that effort, I think Deputy PM Phạm Bình Minh may have a good chance. He's a career diplomat and he has a good international experience. That means he will have the necessary credentials to be elected into the president's position. I think he's one of his relative weaknesses is that his support base may not be as strong and as broad as some other candidates, because he has long been working as a foreign minister, and his contacts may be more limited than other people. Next, the position of Prime Minister. By tradition, this position is reserved for one of the Deputy PM, and Mr. Hui is a former Deputy PM before he was transferred to become the Party Secretary of Hanoi. Anyway, he has the credentials to become the next PM because of his past track record and also his past portfolio, which make him a better candidate or more suitable candidate, to fill that position. Next is the National Assembly chair position. I think among the 7 current Politburo member who may be considered for position, Ms. Trương Thị Mai may be the front runner because of her credentials and professional history. But another factor is that she is the only lady, only woman among the 7 members, and the party may want to have one female leader in the top leadership to present some balance, gender representation in the top leadership, and that is good for the national image as well. Lastly, the standing member of the secretariat. Again, the 7 members may be considered, but I think the front runner may be Mr. Phạm Minh Chính, who is the current head of the Personnel and Organization Commission. So that's my views on the election of the top leadership. But a caveat here is that, okay, predictions. We know that we have to wait until the Party Congress takes place to know whether my predictions are correct or not. And just to sum up, we just go back to the previous questions that I mentioned earlier about the structural factors. As I said, it's likely that the party will revert to the 4-pillar structure. The age limit, okay, this is big unknown, and it's going to be decided later, maybe until the last days before the Congress. The balanced regional representation, I think, is likely to be flexible. There have been precedents, in the past in which, there's no top leader from the central region. So now, if there's no leader from the south, it may be considered as acceptable, at least for the next term. Again, the last question, balance of power between competing candidates. I think we all know that support from other Politburo members or Central Committee members is very important. But in this case, I think the support from Mr. Trong is the key here. Anyone gets the endorsement of Mr. Trong will stand a better chance to be elected. So if you want to predict who is likely to win the election or win a specific position, let's take a look at the level of support that he or she may enjoy, from Mr. Trump, and that will give some very meaningful clues. Now, I would like to wrap up by discussing some political implications, for the country and the political system here. So, as I mentioned, certain norms like the age limit and the regional imbalance may be compromised or may be ignored in the next election due to circumstances. One question we will have to follow is, will it be one-off or it will be repeated in the future as well? I think that is, something important to follow, to know how the party is going to institutionalize the norms, for different things, among them leadership transition. Another question is, because of rather smooth leadership transition to be orchestrated by Mr. Trump. A big question is the new government, because you know that then in May next year, the new National Assembly will be elected, and by tradition, the new government will be elected by the new National Assembly. But in 2016, that tradition was broken, and the new government was appointed in April by the old by the current National Assembly because of the specific conditions back then, and they decided to do so. But this time around, another question is that whether the new government will be elected by the old or the new National Assembly. I think it's better for the party and the government to revert to the old tradition and let the new National Assembly to elect the new government. The third question is how the anti-corruption campaign will be conducted in the future, how intense that is, and what is the new focus. I think it will be continued, and I think it's a good thing for the party and also for the country. But again, what is the new focus? I think it's time for the party to shift the focus of the campaign to lower level corruption, because that is more meaningful for the economy and also for the general public as well. And lastly, any further political or institutional reforms down the road? I think for the next leadership, the priority is still economic development and economic reforms. But again, I think the party is aware of some limitations in the political and institutional mechanism or systems of the party, and there may be efforts to conduct some reforms within the next 5 years, especially to make sure that the party the political system does not constrain the economic potential of the country. So that's it. That's my take, and I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Hiep. You covered a lot of ground here. Let me just pass the mic to Professor Phu Trang. Professor Phu Trang, please.
Oh, hi, should we have Hiep to? Great. Thank you, Hiep. That's a very informative presentation, and I learned a lot from your presentation. So I would talk about the accomplishments and legacies of Mr. Nguyen Phu Trang. And you've learned from Dr. Hiep that he's the current General Secretary of the party, and he's also since 2011 and since 2018 he doubled as state president. So the questions: what has he accomplished in his nearly a decade in office as the top leader in the leadership? And the second question is, what is he leaving behind when he steps down? He expected to step down next year. And I know that, collective decision making is how politics is made, the policy is made at the top in Vietnam. But at the same time, there are policies and issues that can be traced to Mr. Trong personally. So I hope to make some reflections on that, and then hope to get your useful feedback during the Q&A. So let me begin by quickly summarizing Mr. Nguyen Phu Trang's career, as you see in these two slides. So as you see in this slide, Mr. Trong was born in 1944 near Hanoi. He began working for the Communist Party's journal since the 1960s all the way to the 1990s, when he rose up to become the editor-in-chief. In the meantime, he spent about 3 years in the Soviet Union to study. And then he became a Politburo in 1997, and then rose to become General Secretary in 2011. So that's kind of a brief view of his career. And what is very interesting about Mr. Trong is that he had a very unremarkable career before 2011. He had few known accomplishments before then, before he rose to the top position. That may be why he got the nickname Trong Lu, forgetful Trong, by his detractors and rivals. But the rivals may have underestimated the man, right? So that's what, he got a very smooth rise to the Politburo at the age of 53. And he spent a long tenure, like 23 years in the Politburo, in that top body, policy-making body for 23 3 years. That's quite a long time for him. So let me just go to the and based on his career, I think his key strength is his long tenure in the Politburo, and his key weakness is his loyalty to Marxism, Leninism. So let's see. So another slide here. So Mr. Trong has been in the top position for a longer time and has had more accomplishments than his two immediate predecessors. These accomplishments include 5 areas that I will talk about one by one in the rest of my speech. One is diplomacy, then defense, then economy, then party building and anti-corruption. And then the last one is building the police state. So these areas, each of these areas, I draw my observations based on particular policies that were either championed by Mr. Trong or were enacted during his time. Let's see. So now let's start with diplomacy. So in February 2012, the Politburo under Mr. Trong issued an important policy, and the goal was to strengthen the role of the party in foreign policy making. So one of the most curious things about Vietnam's communist system is that the party chief is the most powerful leader in the system, but he's not a head of state. So he cannot play an open role in diplomacy. So one of the goals of this new policy back in 2012 was to make foreign countries respect this curious aspect of the Vietnamese communist system. And another goal was to use party-to-party diplomacy to solve territorial conflicts with neighboring countries. So the new policy has allowed Mr. Nguyen Phu Trang to travel around the world, and he did make the most of the opportunity. As you see, he visited 20 countries by 2019, and he probably the most traveled party chief in the party's history after Ho Chi Minh. That's my, okay. So because all of Vietnam's immediate neighbors are communist or former communist, using party-to-party diplomacy seems to be an appropriate way for working for improving relations. And party-to-party diplomacy actually favors Vietnam in its relationship with Cambodia and Laos, because the ruling parties in these two countries are junior to the Vietnamese Communist Party, and they actually owe the Vietnamese Communist Party for their rise to power, right? With the party-to-party diplomacy, the Vietnamese Communist Party can take advantage of that past to gain an advantage in the relations. But then when we turn to China, the VCP actually is a junior party, and it actually owes the Chinese Communist Party a lot during the war, for its help during the war. So this policy of using party-to-party diplomacy actually put Vietnam at a disadvantage in its relationship with China. And the policy actually has failed to stop China in the South China Sea as Vietnamese leaders hope. So this is a big legacy of Mr. Nguyen Phu Trang that his successor will have to deal with. Second, another area of accomplishments is about defense. So in many of his speeches and actions, Mr. Nguyen Phu Trang displayed a naive trust in China as a fellow communist comrade. He also displayed a poor understanding of the strategic importance of the South China Sea for Vietnam over the years. So as an example, the Central Committee Resolution number 28 in April 2014, decided that two of the main goals of Vietnam's defense strategy was to remain a socialist country. That's one goal. And the other goal was to avoid war. And the strategies to achieve these goals include multiple level diplomacy, include upgrading defense capacity and mobilizing more popular resources for defense. So looking back, after 10 years under Mr. Trump, Vietnam has been able to keep peace with China. And this is a big accomplishment in many ways. And Sino-Vietnamese relations have not become hostile, right, despite all these clashes in the South China Sea. But at the same time, this has caused Vietnam to cede more and more control over the South China Sea to China and caused the party to lose much domestic legitimacy. So this is a headache that Mr. Trump's left for his successor, who will have to deal with, whether how to deal with China in the China Sea. The third area I want to discuss is the economy. So we know that Mr. Trump was at one point opposed to the bilateral trade agreement with the US. This is back in the 1990s. And he's also the chief promoter of the state-owned enterprises. And he wanted them to play the central role, to play the dominant role in the Vietnamese economy. While to his credit, over the years, he has softened some of these positions, some of these modified some of these objections. And this was reflected as an example in the Central Committee Resolution number 22, issued in March 2014. This resolution supports Vietnam's global integration. So this is, Mr. Trump used to be against this, but then he now supports this resolution. And it supports Vietnam's global integration by seeking more trade agreements and foreign investment. And the goals are to first to develop Vietnamese economy, and second, to help Vietnam's defense by binding trade partners' interests to political stability under communist rule. So, within this policy to promote Vietnam's global integration, there was a defense component. But then I think this policy is quite misguided and short-sighted. Thanks to foreign investment and trade agreements, the Vietnamese economy has been able to grow. But then without economic restructuring and measures to improve Vietnam's national competitiveness, then the Vietnamese economy cannot move up the global production chain and can become vulnerable to global shocks. In the late 1990s, the party set the goal for Vietnam to become an industrialized country in 2020. Now we are in 2020, and the party has admitted the failure to achieve that goal. And it's setting either 2035, I think I've seen a draft that say the new goal, the new target date is either 2035 or 2045 that Dr. Hiệp mentioned. But given the failure to embrace economic restructuring, I think it seems likely that Vietnam will fail again, unfortunately. The fourth area, which also where Mr. Trump has had the most accomplishments, is in party building and anti-corruption. So over his term, Mr. Trump has repeatedly emphasized the danger of the party losing its legitimacy because of corruption, and the danger of party members losing their belief in socialism, Marxism, Leninism. This fear of these dangers came from studying the Soviet experience. But then the solution that Mr. Trump and his comrades came up with actually was borrowed in part from the playbook of Xi Jinping, the Chinese Communist Party's chief. So over his term, Mr. Trump was able to get the Politburo to issue many new rules to strengthen central control over its branches and members. The Central Party now has more control over the state-owned enterprises and the notoriously corrupt Ministry of Public Security than it used to have. And Mr. Trong has also pushed for more systematic selection and circulation of the so-called seat cadres nationally. So we now have 23 out of 63 provinces, having their party chiefs appointed from outside the province. So this is kind of a sign of increasing central control over local politics. We know that Mr. Trump tried unsuccessfully to discipline Prime Minister Nguyen Phu Trang, and he has, on the other hand, revived the Central Internal Committee, the Ban Nội Chính Trung ương, and empowered the Central Inspection Committee, Ban Kiểm tra Trung ương, and prosecute many high-ranking corrupt officials. And he has, as you can see from this slide, prosecuted about 70 high-ranking officials, including one incumbent Politburo member. And Mr. Trong, frequently uses the analogy of the oven in his campaign against corruption. So he has earned the nickname the Great Oven Operator, as you see in the slide. So 70 central officials have been burned, and you could see here some of these faces. This is the Politburo member who's now in jail, and Trịnh Xuân Thanh is the one that was abducted in Germany and brought back to Vietnam for trial. And a couple of these people still kind of hiding somewhere. But these are considered burn, can be considered burn firewood, to use Mr. Trump's analogy. So I would argue that Mr. Trump has been able to slow the decay of the party during his last term, but not to reverse the process, like the next, his successor may try to, but then without changing the one-party system, without increasing public supervision of officials, without changing the way that the state is having too much control over public property. Corruption is gonna take place on a large scale. And that there's still a lot more unburned firewood that any effort, any program can burn. Now, the last area I want to talk about is in building a police state, what we can call a police state. So when the current Politburo began its term, there were 4 police generals in the membership, which is the highest representation of the public security sector in this important body. The revised constitution of 2013 and the laws issued under Mr. Trump are even more repressive, or just as repressive as they used to be. Under these laws, hundreds of bloggers and activists have been arrested and prosecuted, with the rising rates of arrest and heavier terms of imprisonment, as you see from these data here. So if you see, toward the end of the table is the second term of Mr. Trump, and you could see the number of dissidents arrested and dissidents tried in court increased a lot over time. So according to a report by the defenders, there are now about 240 who they consider as prisoners of conscience, who have been accused of various crimes against the government, for just blocking. Let's see, where's this? So clearly, Vietnam has become more repressive under Mr. Trump. Violent domestic conflicts, as we have seen in the Dong Tom village last January, are expected to become more common in the future, and the prisons will continue to be packed with bloggers and activists. So to conclude my presentation, Mr. Nguyen Phu Trang's accomplishments are more significant than his two previous predecessors. He will likely overshadow his successor, who has had shorter tenure and less seniority and power.
Okay, thank you.
I'm not done yet. I'm not done. I'm sorry, just just a couple of minutes. So, so the next, like I said, the next leader seems to lack, certainly lack vision, lack seniority, and lack power. But then the next decade is actually posing even greater challenges for the party. So, and the questions are, you know, can the party overcome security and economic challenges? Can the party stay on top of rapid social changes? The only hopes we can have in the post-war generation born in the 1970s, but I don't really know how they will manage it or whether they can, because the challenges are so overwhelming. So that's all I have to say. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Professor Volter, for also very deep analysis into the legacies of General Secretary Nguyen Phu Trang. Before I open the floor to the online audience, the online audience are really typing in their questions. May I pose maybe one or two questions to our distinguished panelists? I would like to ask both of you, this principle of collective leadership, observers have said is a hallmark of or key characteristics of Vietnam's top leadership, as opposed to the type of top leadership in China. In China, we tend to see a centralization of power, or some would argue over-centralization of power in the hands of one individual. So in Vietnam, the preference seems to be more in favor of different individuals holding the key centers of power at the very top. So for the benefit of the audience, maybe you can elaborate what accounts for this preference, and why is it that this preference seems to have some element of durability to it? Because as you all have mentioned, in the next party congress, the post of General Secretary and President is likely to be held by two separate individuals, back to two separate individuals, rather than being held by one individual. And one specific question for Professor Volter is that you talk about party-to-party ties with China when you mention General Secretary Chow's legacy. I think I recall you saying that it is somewhat of a disadvantage. But I suppose it also depends on the situation and incidents, right? Because sometimes I recall there was an incident in 2014. The 2014 episode between China and Vietnam over the Paracel Islands. Eventually, this episode was turned around through party-to-party links, if I don't recall wrongly. They resumed talks through party-to-party links and turned around this tension between the two countries at the height of their antagonism over the deployment of this oil rig. So maybe I invite now Professor Volter to speak first, and then followed by Hiep. Just change the order a bit. Yeah.
Great. Thanks. Thanks for your very good questions. First question: the origins of collective leadership in Vietnam. I think that may have something to do with the fact of the initial leadership. They came from different factions, like Ho Chi Minh, came from outside, and then there was this, the first secretary after 1945 was from the northern faction, and there was the southern faction, and so because of that, the politics back to that time, they have to maintain a kind of collective leadership position. I mean, mode of policy making, and they have been able to maintain it over the years. Thanks to particular individuals individuals. And then over time, it became a tradition that, like later leaders are more likely to repeat because, like to challenge tradition is risky, right? So that's just like my explanation. Maybe he has a better explanation. But then turning to your second question about the party's ties with China, maybe I'm wrong, I don't know. But I think, like in principle, that using party-to-party diplomacy for Vietnam to use it with China is not the good thing to do. It's not the wise thing to do. And so Vietnam may be able to score a few small battles, but then overall it's gonna win the big game. It's gonna lose strategically. So that's my answer to your question.
Okay. Yep.
Great, thank you, Nguyen Phu. I would like to focus on your first question because you posed that question specifically to me. I think Vietnam's preference for collective leadership, and in this case, a four-pillar structure rather than a three-pillar structure, is based on its own historical experience. They want to avoid a strongman who may make mistakes, that may harm the country and the party, and it is further reinforced by the fact that, or by the examples elsewhere. For example, the party is very well aware of the, how the Communist Party in the former Soviet Union, came to an end, and they realized that the role of Mr. Gorbachev is very important, and they want not to repeat that mistake, to allow a certain politician to accumulate too much power that the party cannot control. Another reason is to maintain a check and balance within the system, because it's one party system. There's no opposition, so it's very difficult to check and balance, against the certain factions or certain politicians. So if there are more positions in the top leadership, it's easier to have some measure of check and balance there. And I think there's another less significant but also practical reason here, that is, if there are 4 positions instead of 3, there will be more opportunities for Politburo members to be promoted into the top leadership, more seats, more opportunity for them. So the Politburo members and also ultimately the central committee members may prefer to have more 4 top positions rather than 3. That's my answer.
Okay, thank you. I look at the Q&A online. They are coming in fast and furious. Okay, there's a question for Hiap on with regards to the National Congress, how he would decide the socio-economic agenda for Vietnam from 2021 to 2030, and in particular, what do you think would be included in this socio-economic agenda, and do you think the party's plan for development would also reflect what the ordinary people also want?
Okay, thank you for the question. You may want to refer to the party document to know in details. I don't have the details here, but basically for the next 10 years, the goal of Vietnam is, the party is to elevate Vietnam to the higher middle income level within the next 10 years. And by 2045, Vietnam they aim to bring Vietnam to the level of high income economy. And in order to achieve the higher middle income level within the next 10 years, they will have to implement different reforms to maintain economic growth and to make the economy more sustainable, more resilient, and to help the economy climb up the global value chain. And I think if you look at the documents, you can see that yes, the party align is policy along that goals.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Okay, this next 2 questions, I invite both Professor Volta and Hiap to answer as well, but I'll pose it the 2 questions. One is by Tien Bui. The observation is made that none of the candidates for the top 4 positions are Southerners, meaning that the regional balance, the norm of regional balance, is not applicable for this time, at least this time. And however, among the likely re-elected Politburo members, one possible candidate is the Southerner, Mr. Vu Van Tung. And the questioner observes that you have excluded his chance on the basis of his relatively young age. So the question posed is this exclusion fair enough? And on what other grounds for excluding him from running for the top 4 position as a Southerner to maintain regional balance? Okay, and this is the first question. The second question is, how is the quota for regional representation, North, Central, South in the Politburo reach? And to achieve this, can there be an exception for a younger politician from the South? And a sub-question is that, does the next leader's approach to China and US factor? Is it a choice, or is it a criteria in the choice of leaders for the next Politburo? Okay, Hiap, you go first, followed by Vu Tung to respond to these 2 questions.
Thank you, Anh Thiam, for your question. I just want to clarify that I don't think that we should exclude Mr. Tung from the possibility of being promoted, but I just said that his chance to be elected is rather lower than other candidates. Of course, there are different criteria to be considered here. I can mention a few here. First, past experience. I think Mr. Thung's past experience is still rather limited than some other candidates, perhaps because of his relative young age. He used to be an official in Ho Chi Minh City, and he served briefly as a party secretary of Quảng Ngãi province, and then he went back to Ho Chi Minh City before being promoted to the Politburo. But anyway, his experience may be more limited than other candidates. Other factors, I think one important factor here is whether is his past political loyalty or affiliation. I think people are well aware of what happened. So his past affiliation may be a negative factor for him. And then there's a factor of balance of power. Who gets the more support from the Central Committee and Politburo member, and also Mr. Trong. It's difficult to answer this question, but in my assessment, his support base is smaller than some other candidates. For the selection criteria to maintain the regional balance, I think it depends on the strategic personnel planning of the party. And in doing the planning, I think the party tried to ensure some regional balance in the top leadership as well as in the Politburo. But of course, there are different factors that may change the outcome, and it's not always the case that this balance is maintained. One particular reason may be the unavailability of qualified candidates, because they have to earmark a person for promotion long before he is or she is actually promoted into the Politburo, and along the way there may be incidents that may change the career path of that particular candidate, and so they have to look for a new candidate. And that's only one example, but there are different factors that may shape the outcome. But my argument is that the party is aware of that requirement, and they try to maintain some balance during the course of personnel planning. For the question on U.S., China, with a person's foreign policy thinking, whether that will impact their possibility of election or not, I think it depends. In most of the cases, their likelihood is determined by their own qualities, their own performance in the past, as well as their relevance for the positions that they are going to hold. But in certain cases, yes, that may be a factor. For example, I think in the case of Mr. Phạm Bình Minh, that may be a factor. I don't want to go into detail here, but yes, because of his family background as well as his current position, that expose him to some sensitivities, and that may affect his future promotion to some extent. So that's my answer.
Professor Vu Tung, you. Yes.
I agree mostly with Hiap, and what I can add is that Mr. Phuc may play up the regional card, because he's from Quảng Nam, right? So it's kind of southern, even though it's not, really kind of deep in the Mekong Delta. But he may play up that card to argue for his role for continuing to serve another term, because otherwise, like the four pillars would be, kind of occupied by all Northerners, right? So Mr. Phuc may play up that card. Mr. Thượng, he's a Southerner who does ideological work, and he was. He surprised me when he got into that into the Politburo, because like Southerners are not to be trusted that much, doing ideological work. They like maybe the stereotype is wrong, but then they consider too practical and not so loyal. So that's hard for him. That's why it's hard. It would be hard for him, even though even if he were older, to rise to the top of the Politburo, and and then that's his expertise, right, in ideology. So he can be a prime minister, he can be this and that. So so left that leaves his future kind of bleak. Like it might be difficult for him to advance further. In terms of the role of China and US, I think I agree with him about Phạm Bình Minh, and if China, in the next month or two, if China does something crazy in the South China Sea, then Mr. Phạm Bình Minh would see his status elevated in the Politburo. But if not, then it's an open question. So a lot depends on kind of the changing relationship between Vietnam and China and the US.
Okay, thank you. Okay, next question is by Adam Ford, our one of our participants for our fiscal symposium next year. He asked if there is any representation in the Central Committee for the mass organizations. Maybe Hiap, you want to answer?
Yes. The short answer is yes. The leader of most mass organizations, important ones, are earmarked for Central Committee leadership. Membership.
Okay. Two questions by the next questioner. In particular, more relevant to our discussion here is how exactly does the Central Organizing Committee of the party operate? And how can it avoid corruption in ensuring a certain individual's nomination to a position? This one, maybe Professor Phu Trang, you can answer. And the next, the second sub question is, I think maybe Hiap is more relevant for you. Has it been your observation that the party and the Politburo are eyeing the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030, rather than just purely focusing on economic development? Professor Phu Trang, maybe you go first.
I'm not quite sure I understood the question. So the question is, how does the Central Committee operate?
Yeah, maybe maybe you can start by saying what does the Central Organization Commission do, and what are its daily affairs?
Oh, the Central Organization?
Yeah, Central Organization Commission.
Okay, so that is a very important commission or department within the central leadership, and they keep all the files of the members, party members, especially the upper levels, and they participate in selecting candidates for leadership jobs. From from I think the deputy provincial chief up, or even like going a bit lower to the department level in cities and provinces. So they keep all the personnel file, and they have a lot of power over over like the parties, because of the files that they keep. So that's the answer to the question.
Okay, yep. On the
Yes.
economic question on the sustainable development goals.
Yes, sustainability or greener economic growth is one of the priority for the party now because of the consequences of lopsided economic development, which disregard some environmental consequences, and this has become an issue for the public recently, especially when we look at the unhappiness of the public regarding the air quality in major cities like Hanoi or Ho Chi Minh City, or before that, the natural disaster caused by Formosa Hating in 2016. I think that means the party and the government are now well aware of maintaining the balance between economic development and environmental preservation, and we can see that change of thinking, especially in the sector of power development. Currently, Vietnam is still highly dependent on coal-fired power plant. About 43% of Vietnam's power mix is from coal-fired power plants. But now they want to reduce the share of coal-fired power plants. And in the past 5 years, a lot of renewable energy projects have been adopted and implemented. And in the future, I think that policy will continue, and they want to increase the share of renewable energy projects as well as gas-fired power plants, which are considered as more environmentally friendly. And I think this kind of thinking is applicable to other sectors as well. So my short answer is yes. They want to promote environmental sustainability in socio-economic development in the next 10 years and beyond.
Okay, there's a question on the Politburo. Specifically, which of the potentially re-elected and to be newly re-elected Politburo members do you think might be progressive, i.e. pro-reform? And a related question is by Dr. Olga Dro from the US. She asked, she was wondering why the number of the Politburo members cannot change, and that in particular reference to HIAP, you seem to be set on the number 19. So she asked why this particular magic number 19. And you also mentioned the possible names, Miss Mai. It sounded to her like an affirmative action, maybe affirmative endorsement. But then why there is no affirmative action for the South? I suppose candidates from the South. So yeah, maybe you want to take this too. Yeah. Professor Boteng, if you have inputs also, you can also join in.
So,
yeah. Well, thank you for the questions. On the question of who in the new Politburo may be pro-reform or liberal-minded, or who is conservative, I think it's difficult to answer, and there's a long list there. I cannot go into details for each candidate, but I think it very much depends on the position that they will hold. For example, traditionally, if you look at the past prime ministers, okay, they are generally more pro-reform, more reformist. I think that is because of their job that requires reformist policies. If they don't reform or they don't support reforms, they cannot promote economic growth, and they cannot meet, he or she cannot fulfill his duties or his obligations as a prime minister. But meanwhile, if you look at the general secretary position, for example, his top priority is not promote economic priority, but to maintain the party's leadership, the party's rule, and the party's survival. And to meet that target, I think, or to achieve that goal, generally speaking, that position is more conservative, especially ideologically. That does not mean that they are not reformist in terms of promoting economic development. I think now it's impossible for a conservative to gain top leadership if they don't support, economic development or economic liberalization. I think that's irreversible. But as I mentioned, ideologically, yes, there may be some reservations in certain issues depending on the position that a person holds. The next question, the Politburo membership, why 19? I think that number is not fixed, and in the past, the number of Politburo members varies between 14 to 19, but this time around, I think they will try to maintain the 19 membership members, because I think that's a fair number, because if we look at the total number of Central Committee member, 180 full members, I think 19 members is a good rate, about 10% or more than 10% a bit. And I think that's both ensure the representation and also the structure of collective leadership and concentrated power in the Politburo. They cannot expand it too much because that will dilute the power of the Politburo, but they cannot concentrate or downsize too much because that will create some kind of power imbalance within the Central Committee. For the case of Ms. Mai, I think we have to wait and see, but I think she stands a good chance because of her credentials and also the fact that she is a female and a woman, and she and the party leadership may want to maintain some level of gender balance in the top leadership, because that helps to promote the party's image and also the national image. And she is the only female candidate at the moment. For the regional balance, as I discussed earlier, there are different factors at work, and it's more complicated. So although the party wants to wish to maintain that balance, it's not, maybe it may not be workable in this case.
Okay, for Professor Phu Trang, two related questions for you. Do you think the police state, I'm not sure if it's phrased correctly, but the state of the police state will increase or decrease with the new leadership that come in next year? And with regard to central control, do you expect more or less central control with the new leadership? There is one question. A related question is from Peter Kowan, who said that you expect an increasing number of violent clashes like the Dongdam incident, partly due to the build-up of the police state. The question is there a consensus within the party or Politburo for continuing to ramp up the police state and suppression? Are there dissenting voices opposing this? Professor Phu Trang, please.
Great, thanks for the question. Again, these are just speculations, and we have to see how the Ministry of Public Security perform, in the election, to see how many of their people join the next Politburo and the Central Committee to know for sure. So on the one hand, in the last few years, they have been tainted with so many corruption cases. And one case, actually, a police general was organizing or sponsoring or supporting a gambling, site. And the office was actually based in the backyard of the Ministry of the Public Security for this gambling thing. And so the police has been tainted in the last few years, but at the same time, it remains a very powerful and important institution in the Vietnamese Communist state. It's kind of one of the two pillars of the state, right? The other pillar is the military. So it remains very powerful, and the current minister is expected to continue. They lost an important leader, in the person of Trần Đại Quang, who passed away. So that kind of weakened them a little bit, but then we have to wait and see.
Okay, thank you.
I hope I answered the question.
Yes. Okay, we have a question from Paul Schuler for both Hiep and Professor Phu Trang. Hiep raised the question of the meaning of the Congress in terms of factions in the Vietnam Communist Party. The question is, are there identifiable factions at the top in the Politburo comparable to what people theorize in China? For example, is there a Nguyen Phu Trang faction? or has the Nguyen Phu Trang's faction been eliminated? Here, please, you start first, then followed by Professor Phu Trang.
I think unlike the previous, before 2016, when there was competing or rival camps within the party led by Mr. Trong and Mr. Dung, since 2016, I think the power in the party is concentrated in the top leadership, especially Mr. Trong. Although there are different factions within the party, and I think that's something natural. It exists anywhere in any national politics anywhere in the world. But in Vietnam, I think yes, there are different factions, there are different groups within the central committee, even in the top leadership. But there's no the main thing is that there's no visible competition or clash between them. And so far, Mr. Trump is still in control. But I think now with Mr. Trump stepping down at the next party congress, it remains to be seen where the factionalism will rise again, and that will depend a lot on the leadership of the next general secretary, whether he will be able to wield enough control, wield enough power to prevent factionalism from rising again or not. And I think for that we have to wait and see.
Okay, Professor Phu Trang.
Sure.
In addition, Professor Phu Trang, before you answer, a related question to you is, do you think Nguyen Phu Trang would be able to maintain his influence over the Politburo, even if he stepped down next year? So you answer the first question and a follow-up question, this second question.
First question, I agree with him, and I want to add something about factional, not really factions, but then about the provincial ties, kind of an Ninh Bình faction, with Trần Đại Quang, Đinh Thế Huynh, and Đinh La Thăng, right? But then that faction, that group is gone, and now it seems like the Nghệ An folks are rising, with Phan Đình Trạc and Vương Đình Huệ, right? And then I think there's one more, I just can't remember. So so there may be this kind of ties, very important in Vietnamese politics that haven't been studied at all, and they may form the basis for in terms of the influence of Nguyen Phu Trang over the Politburo, to the extent that his own candidate becomes the next party chief. He still has some influence over the Politburo, but I don't expect it to be very much.
Okay, there is a question from Swen Bing To. Maybe it's a bit sensitive, but you see whether you can answer to some extent. He observed that the recent development has been the arrest and investigation of Mr. Nguyen Phu Trang recently, who is the chairman of the People's Committee of Hanoi. Could does Mr. Chung have any chance of entering either the Central Committee or the Politburo, and whether his recent arrest will pose an obstacle to his entry? And also, then, how much do you expect anti-corruption campaign is used as a tool to, I think, is to take out competitors in the future as a political tool? I invite Professor Phu Trang. Maybe you start first.
Sure. Just a quick answer. Mr. Chung is out of the question, with his arrest. He's over. His career is over. And in terms of the next question is about what's the next question? I'm sorry.
I suppose the question I think is anti-corruption campaign.
Right. Yeah, it has been used in the past, and it will be used again. So even under Mr. Trump, some of his allies were not prosecuted at all. Like someone mentioned, Võ Kim Cự, who was the Bí Thư, the party secretary of Hà Tĩnh, who should have been prosecuted, and like together with Mr. Trịnh Xuân Thanh, there were several other officials, corrupt officials, who fled abroad, but Mr. Trump did not try to prosecute them as well. So.
Okay, yep.
I agree with Professor Thung's comments, and I have no further inputs here. I just want to highlight the fact that, okay, of course, the anti-corruption campaign may be used as a convenient tool for certain factions in the party to purge, rivals, but that does not discredit the fact that the people persecuted really committed corruption. The other question is why some are persecuted, some are not, and I think Mr. Professor Thung has answered that question.
Okay, the two questions that come up, I will pose one to Professor Phu Trang and one to Hiep. For Professor Phu Trang, for the new leadership that is coming up, how do you predict they will negotiate or maneuver in terms of the US-Vietnam relationship on the one hand and the China-Vietnam relationship on the other hand? How do you think they will handle this relationship? And given the fact that the US-China relationship, we see very intense and increasing tension between the two countries. That's for Professor Phu Trang. Dr. Hiep, I would like you to answer this question. To what extent do you think the Vietnam's successful response to COVID can have an impact on the upcoming Congress? So Professor Phu Trang first.
Sure. Thanks for a great question. Based on my observation in the last 2 decades, Vietnamese leadership lacks a strategic vision in their policy toward the great powers like the US and China. And their policy has tended to be very reactive. Like China is moving forward in making moves in the South China Sea, then they reacted to that. Or the US is offering them this or that, and they reacted to that. Instead of having a strategic vision of where Vietnam wanted to be 20 years from now, where Vietnam, how can Vietnam kind of rise to become a strong country and so on. So that's my answer to that question. And then going forward, I expect that to continue as well, because the new leadership, doesn't give me any hope in terms of the vision that they have.
Okay. Yep.
Thank you. Before I go into my question, I just want to briefly comment on the first question. I think
yes, please. Yeah.
No matter who will be elected into the new leadership, I think Vietnam will try to maintain a fine balance between the two powers. Of course, given the intensification of strategic rivalry between China and the US is becoming more and more difficult for Vietnam, but Vietnam anyway will try to maintain that balance. I think the key factor that may change that calculation is China's actions in the South China Sea. As Professor Thung has mentioned, Vietnam's rather active, and Vietnam's policy towards China and the US will be determined by how aggressive, how assertive, how expansionist, how coercive China is in the South China Sea. If China keeps acting assertively in the South China Sea at the expense of Vietnam's core interests, I think there's a growing consensus in Vietnam to move a bit closer towards the US to counterbalance China. And I think the answer to that question will be answered by Beijing's actions as well. Going to the next question, how Vietnam's successful response to COVID-19 will shape the upcoming Congress? I think not much, except for the fact that some politicians who have been playing a leading role in the fight against COVID-19 may be given more credibility. And I think in this case, Deputy Prime Minister Vũ Đức Đam, who is in charge of Vietnam's COVID-19 response and who has done a very good job over the past few months, I think he has been recognized for that achievement. And that's also the reason why in the recent plenum, he wins the most votes among the Central Committee for candidature into the next Politburo.
Okay, next. As a question posed to Professor Phu Trang, from Olga, you mentioned that Trong succeeded because of his loyalty to Marxist-Leninism, and that one of the key goals was that Vietnam will remain socialist and continue to do so. And what does it mean when you say this? Because from the point of view of Marxist-Leninism, Vietnam is today no longer socialist, at least its economic basis is not. So Professor Phu Trang.
So that's a $60,000 question, right? and I would suggest that Professor Olga Draw ask Mr. Trong himself, because a lot of kind of foreign observers are baffled by that question. Like how can he say that? How can he still saying that? How can he still expecting Vietnam to follow Marxism, Leninism, and so on? But like if you look further into more deeply into the economy, you could see that elements of the old institutions still remain, right? Like state-owned enterprises that still account for like 30% of the economy. Public ownership of property, right? Even though now the officials are kind of stealing these public property and getting rich. As the most recent case is the member of the National Assembly who was discovered to own citizenship in Cyprus. So it's just kind of the latest scandal about officials stealing from public property and getting rich. So you could still see that public ownership of property and the party state system and many elements of Stalinist or Maoist socialism.
Thank you. So we are actually nearing the end of our webinar, but maybe we can extend by about 5 minutes because I see that there are a lot of questions, but I would like to say that we may not be able to answer all of the questions, but let us take at least 2 more questions going forward. There is a question from Philip Bui for both speakers. I invite both speakers because it has to do with the factions and in particular, he asks, are there still so-called Cải Cách, reform and Giáo dục conservative factions within the Politburo? If so, can you say, I think it's supposedly specifically who is who and exactly what it means by Cải Cách and Giáo dục in terms of national policy? Professor Phu Trang, maybe you go first.
Well, there has been a long-standing kind of schism in Vietnamese politics between those leaders who support more reforms, faster reforms, and other leaders who fear for the survival of the regime and the party and advocate for slow reform or as little reform as possible, as long as the party can stay on top. So that's kind of define the conflict between them on many issues. It's not just foreign policy, like closer to the West in the US or closer to China, or in defense, in education, in the economy, whether to aside the state sector the central role in the economy, or whether promote private enterprises and so on. So these issues can be spread out all over the political sphere.
Yep.
I think I have no inputs because I have to some extent answered the question to another question before. And if you allow me, Nguyen Phu, I would like to respond to one question I think addressed to me, and I think that is significant here. From Johan Anvin, who said that you mentioned that the VCP will likely pursue further economic reforms and possibly political reforms so as not to limit economic reforms. And the question is, what are the areas of political reforms that may be considered, in that regard? I think this is important question because the party is very enthusiastic about economic reforms, but is rather reticent or careful with political reforms. But there's some consensus among the researchers that to some extent the political system, the nature of Vietnam's political system has constrained economic performance to some extent. And in the future that may be addressed, especially if Mr. Phạm Minh Chính is promoted, because he is seen as a pro-reform politician and who has conducted many reforms in the past when he was party secretary of Quảng Ninh province. And I think in the future there are some areas that may be reformed, that is to remove some institutional overlaps between the party system and the government system. You know that in Vietnam, there's two parallel systems, the party system and the government system. And that means the system is too big, the political system is too big and spends too much resource. And it also constrains, the functions of the government. And there have been attempts to reform this overlap. And I hope in the future that will go forward as well. Second reform is to come up with some measures to check on corruption. Corruption has been reduced over the past 5 years under the leadership of Mr. Trong, but it's still rampant. And many investors are still discouraged by corruption in Vietnam. And apart from, anti-corruption campaign that target individual politicians, I think there should be systemic reforms to introduce some institutional checks on corruption. It's still unclear how the party can do that, but I think there's an area that the party may want to explore to curb corruption in a more systematic manner. And I think an equally important reform that may be explored is to explore how the party can attract more talents into the party system. Recently, there have been some debates about that, and I think that's a big question because now the party's personnel policy does not, offer a lot of opportunities, to talents outside the party system. And even within the system, the party system, some talents are also not identified and trained and promoted. And that means that if the party can promote some kind of meritocracy within its culture, political culture, and within its organizational principles, and I think that will be very useful for the party and for the country as well, because at this critical juncture, when Vietnam is trying to turn itself into a high-income economy, I think good leadership by qualified leaders who has not only political credits, but also enough capabilities, necessary to navigate the country through the next challenges will be very important. And the question of how to bring in more talents, into the system to help Vietnam achieve that target is very important. That's my take.
Okay, Phu Trang, please.
Yeah, I would like to answer the question by Dr. Nguyen Phu Trang in the Q&A. And the question is, anti-corruption is just another rational decision of the VCP. Looking back to the past, there are many of them, such as Đổi Mới in 1986, playing the game between China and Russia during the Vietnam War, dissolving the CPV and establishing the United Front in the early 1940s. Why has the CPV been able to do it? Why has the party been able to do those things? And why can't it do it today? Well, there are examples in history, and the closest example is like, King Gia Long, King Minh Mạng, right? We had this, emperor who unified Vietnam in 1802. He fought a long, very long battles, and he unified Vietnam. And his son Minh Mạng, was able to expand Vietnam, taking Vietnamese boundaries, over Cambodia and Laos and so on. But then, then came, like Tự Đức, who could not really do anything in the face of French invasion. And I mean, that happened to every dynasty in history, and that happened to every regime that rely on this, not on a more open system of like he just said, meritocratic system, but rely more on family relationship, which is what the Vietnamese Communist Party is relying right now, by choosing many red princes and princesses to take over their parents' position. And there are numerous cases like that, and it just kind of drag the system down, and over time would cause the system further decay and collapse.
Okay, maybe I will pose one final question to Phu Trang and Hiap, then we wrap it up. We may not be able to take all the questions that are in the Q&A section. I just want to bring the discussion back to the core theme. For Professor Phu Trang, you talk about the one of the key legacies of General Secretary Nguyen Phu Trang is his anti-corruption drive. Anti-corruption drive, this drive against corruption, the success can be rated in terms of whether this campaign carries on, right? And at the moment, a lot depends on Nguyen Phu Trang driving it personally. So I would like your assessment in terms of the institutionalization of this anti-corruption drive. In your assessment, do you see institutionalization taking place, because this will underpin whether this campaign is sustainable or not? That's for you, Professor Phu Trang. And final question to you. For Hiep, I would like you to say something about what, in your view, is the ideal Politburo setup, in your view. I know it is a lot of crystal ball gazing, but as from your vantage point, what do you see is the ideal Politburo? And what do you see are the key challenges that this Politburo will face as it assumes its mandate next year? So Professor Phu Trang first, and then Hiep, final say. Professor Phu Trang, please.
Yeah, I think the chance for the anti-corruption campaign to continue strongly depends on the particular individual leaders and the dynamics of relationship among them, which we can't say much about right now. But given past experience, it's more likely than less likely that the anti-corruption campaign is gonna peter out and not be as strong as we have seen in the last few years. Is that your question? Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Hiep.
Okay, thank you, Nguyen Phu. I would like to skip the first part of the question on the line of the Politburo, because I think we have discussed it, and now it remains a question of what really happened at the party congress. So we have to wait and see. I would like to go into more details about the challenges for the next Politburo. I think there are a few challenges here. First, economic challenges. I think, as I mentioned, the party aims to bring Vietnam up to the level of higher middle income country in the next 10 years. And to achieve that goal, I think there are some big challenges how to maintain the economic momentum, going forward, given the COVID-19 and also the disruptions in international trade and the global supply chains caused by US-China competition. And we know that Vietnam is an open economy that depends on trade and investment. And in the next 5 or 10 years, I think it will be more difficult for Vietnam to maintain that growth model. So they may have to think about some alternative ways, to bring Vietnam forward while becoming less dependent on trade and investment. They also have to think of strategies to make Vietnam, to enable Vietnam to climb up the global value chain. That means especially enabling Vietnamese enterprises to diversify or to develop technological capabilities, manufacturing capabilities, so that Vietnam can create more added value within Vietnam rather than relying on labor-intensive industries like it is at the moment. In terms of social challenges, I think a key challenge to address the rising income gap between different segments within the society. The economic income inequality is maybe a liability for the party now, because after 30 years of economic development, the gap is widening, and that may undermine the legitimacy of the party, because the party bases itself on socialist, oriented market economy, and by socialist they mean ensuring some level of equality among the population, and that will be a challenge for the party to maintain or to reduce the income gap in the next 10 years or so. And in terms of foreign policy, as we are all aware, the challenge for Vietnam and also other countries is how to navigate the US-China rising competition between US and China. And for Vietnam, this is all the more important and more critical, given Vietnam's reliance on both China and the US for its economic development and also for national security as well. And given the current situation and ongoing developments, and also the prospect of further intensifying competition between the US and China, that will be a very, very critical question for the next Politburo to handle. And I hope they will be successful in their efforts to address all these challenges.
Thank you.
Me too.
On that, yes. Professor Phu Trang, you wanted to say something?
Oh no, I just said me too. I also hope that
Oh,
they will
okay,
be successful.
okay. Yes, on that note, I would like to thank Dr. Hiap and Professor Phu Trang for sharing their insights with us here today. And I look forward to our continued collaboration with University of Oregon, with Professor Phu Trang, to organize the Fiscal Vietnam Symposium sometime next year, and where I'm very sure that we will benefit from the views of other seasoned experts on Vietnam who are in the audience with us here today. And also, I would like to thank our audience who have tuned in to us from around the world. We appreciate your active participation and questions. I apologize that I'm unable to take all the questions given the time constraints. And in fact, we have actually exceeded our allotted time. And it shows that there is a great deal of interest in this topic on the leadership changes and other related topics that has to do with Vietnam. And this gives us encouragement to do more on this front. And before I close, may I turn to Professor Phu Trang to also make some concluding remarks on this joint webinar. Professor Phu Trang, please.
Oh, I just like to say very briefly that I want to thank all of you for tuning in, and thank the scholars who are part of our group to join us today. And I look forward to our symposium next June, where we can meet in person, hopefully. Thank you.
So a very thank you to all of you from Singapore to all of you out there. Please join us again. Thank you very much. Professor Phu Trang, thanks. Yep,
Thank you.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks everyone.